Dear friends, we're going to start this workshop in a few minutes. I'm waiting for my vice chair to arrive. But in the meantime, I would urge all of you to come and move down towards the center of the room if possible, because I think it will give us a much better setting. This is a round room with a very high podium, which makes us a bit distant. Nonetheless, I think we should be closer together, and I hope for this discussion we can be. So if you would like to move forward, if you feel more comfortable at the back, please stay at the back. But please, I would urge you to move forward so we can all be much closer together for this, this conversation. I'll start in the workshop in a minute. Good afternoon. I'm delighted as Chair of Substa to open this in-session thematic workshop of the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. So I think we already have, as I said, a good room for this. I hope we can all have a very good exchange in this format. Before we start, I think it would be our honor to start this workshop with an Indigenous ceremonial opening. And I welcome Chief François Paulette of the Denesoline Elder and a member of the Smith's Landing Treaty 8 First Nation. Please, Chief Paulette.
Salutina, all my relations. Last night before I was going to bed, I was thinking about how this would all come about. And the thunders have came. Have you heard the thunders? It's a huge gift of the Creator. We are taught that in the spring, when the first thunders come to our land, that we burn sweetgrass or sage or cedar, because the thunders are announcing their energy and the power that the Creator gave them. So I was thankful for them to be here just before we all gathered here. I want to start by saying where we are as people, as human beings. We are in a place of no return of where we were 50 years ago. The abuse of Mother Earth has gotten to us a stage where our lives are all impacted. As Indigenous people from where I come from, we are people of the land, we are people of the river, the mountains, and we carry out ceremonies throughout the seasons, giving thanks. So our children, our elders are looked after. And this abuse has tripled many times over. And I'm saddened today to hear that the government of Canada has approved a pipeline from my part of the world to the sea. That, I feel that. But I'm also happy in some way to hear the government of Canada declaring a climate emergency in our government. That, I'm very happy about that, because we are in a climate crisis. I never say climate change anymore. It's climate crisis. And we have come to a time where we're going to have to prepare ourselves for what is going to happen. And that's not too far from here. That's not too far from now. 5 years, maybe longer. Where I come from in the north, in Canada, they say a prophecy is that people are going to migrate to the north. So they can escape the destruction that is happening in the south. And they're going to be looking for water and food. So today I'm thankful that I'm here. I'm thankful that there are Indigenous people that are embracing their identity, their spiritual identity. And I strongly believe that every time we talk about the environment, Mother Earth, when we speak about Mother Earth, it always should have a spiritual base to it. Our people, First Nation people, Indigenous people, we honor that Mother Earth through ceremonies. I'm going to say prayer in my mother tongue. I would also like you to pray in the best way that you know how. I summoned the grandfathers, the old men, to be here amongst us at this moment. So we can touch our hearts, our minds, and our spirit. Hante abitare ye jan don't see no skesi ke must see no see. No ne tenata clean see no tenach ania hante see bananitea hante aja eteset dilate. No tenach ania see nadate. No tenach ania see that I hanto nasete see hanto see tabanai kide. No tenach ania see et teonizi hanto heart in leni see. Ibon asnede. Betariye, there are Sila Koi. 3C, 3-2, Hante Bananasurde. Hante Betariye, saw C, 3-2, not on C, Nedede. I said that water is life. Water provides for all living things on this planet, in this world. The Batari Yedride 2C. I don't see but see but one schedule you see. So Satiu Hunter see, but I see the Massi. We also have to thank all of the things that are in the water, the fish that sustain us, everything that the water provides to make things grow. I thank them. The batari yesidri sanat al city. I see betanish yesi. The men, our relationship with Father, Son, that makes everything alive during the day. And the moon, the caretakers of womankind. I thank you also. The Betari Yesitri is a Nanaka Yesiti. It's not TSC, it is not TSC, it is Massinorasi. And I thank all the ones and the four-leggeds. The buffalo, the center of all the four-leggeds, with your power and your energy that you provided to us. I see it, your city, that ancho. And all the wingets, all the little birds that provide us songs, I want to thank you. And the eagle that is the messenger. After we talk here, we talk in a good way, the eagle will take our message back to the Creator. And he will announce that this was what was said in this assembly. The batare yesi te ayusi tanishesi eti masinoresi. Tribatata tarakuno hayo sino supeo de masinoresi. And all the things that the plants that we feed on in the spring and the summer, the berries, and all the wood, the trees that feed the animals, feed and make us warm in the winter, and cook our food. Thank you. The batare yesitri no ni tenebata honeta tete tilsi kenezono tanete hat o masinoresi. Creator, grandfathers, I want to thank you for giving us this path so we can continue to walk on this path, to live in harmony and the way we've been instructed through our language of how to live with Mother Earth. So we can be helpers to people that are lost. So we can help what is happening here in this assembly. As Denison Fina, Denechania, Noyakianatsir Horeski. As Dene people, as human people, we need to begin to listen to each other, open our hearts, our minds, and our spirit. Because what is before us is coming very quick, and we need to be prepared. We need to prepare an emergency plan so we can survive as human beings and as people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Francois Paulette, for that ceremony, for that prayer, and for all those thoughts, which I think we should all think how we relate to the world around us. We may use different words, we may use different ways of getting to understand this, and I think one of the challenges we've faced, I think it's one of the opportunities we have with the work we've created with the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, is to bring these different types of knowledge together. I'm conscious at the start of the week, I organized a special event with the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, looking at the work they had done. Just as I've been working with the scientific community and will tomorrow in the research dialogue, which we will hold in this room. And we will have Indigenous knowledge being brought into that conversation tomorrow. But I'm very conscious that in that conversation, it's really about how we as human beings are going to survive and live well on a planet with the natural environment, which provides us our support. And I think, again, we may use different words, different ways of expressing it, but I think we all are facing the same challenge of how to take that forward. So, once again, thank you for that ceremony and that prayer. The Paris Agreement recognized the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in building a climate-resilient future, together with parties, with governments. And a key part of that was the establishment by Decision 1 CP21 in Paris of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, which is intended to allow the exchange of experiences and sharing of best practices on mitigation and adaptation in a holistic and integrated manner. And the COP recognized the need to strengthen knowledge, technologies, practices, and efforts of local communities and indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change. At COP24 in Katowice last year, parties were invited to promote the participation and engagement of local communities, in addition to indigenous peoples, both within the Facilitative Working Group, the FWG, and the platform. And the same decision taken at Katowice encouraged the FWG to collaborate with other organizations and bodies under and outside the convention. So this workshop has been designed to give space and time to discuss this matter, how we can associate also local communities, enhance their participation in addition to that of indigenous peoples in the LCIPP, and to do that in an open forum. It also brings together the ideas and experiences of experts across a range of UN and civil society organizations. I very much hope that through a constructive dialogue on ongoing initiatives and processes, we can develop a better understanding of the concept of local communities and the necessary aspect of self-representation and self-mobilization in the international climate change process. This will inform a wider deliberation on enhancing the participation of local communities in the platform that will take place under SBSTA in 2021. The voices of indigenous peoples and local communities are crucial in the fight against climate change within local, national, regional, and international processes. I would therefore like to thank the Secretariat for ensuring that interpretation in Spanish and French could be secured for this workshop, noting this was a challenge, but realizing its importance for the LCIPP. À ce moment, je vais vous prier de bien vouloir m'excuser du fait que je m'exprime en anglais, et pas en français. Je préfère m'exprimer en français officiellement, mais je suis très content quand même qu'on dispose de l'interprétation dans les 3 langues pour cet événement. Je vais néanmoins continuer en anglais. When it comes to local communities, indigenous peoples and parties working together, as UNFCCC Executive Secretary mentioned at the FWG meeting, it is time to bring different pieces together and recognize our unity of purpose. So through harnessing collective knowledge, this workshop is an opportunity to learn from each other and together, to make important strides towards empowering peoples and communities who continue to embody the principle of sustainable development as a way of life. We strive for climate action and policy that leaves no one behind. So I welcome you all to this important dialogue. I thank you for your participation. And I'm now going to hand over to the 2 people who will co-moderate this work, to my Vice Chair, Anela Anger-Kravi, and to Andrea Carman on behalf of the Facilitative Working Group. Andrea, Anela, over to you for the organization of this workshop, and I wish you great success. I ask you to excuse me because I will have to leave in a short while, but I'll try and follow, and I will certainly look forward to hearing the output of your work.
Thank you very much. First of all, to our elder Francois Palette for helping us to begin this session in a good way by asking for guidance from the Creator so that our thoughts and words here will be positive and in the spirit of common purpose. Thanks also for the opening remarks of the SBSTA Chair, Mr. Paul Watkinson, to provide additional guidance and orientation for our discussions. At this session that was called for in the decision made at COP24, we warmly welcome the input of representatives of Indigenous peoples, organizations, civil society, state parties, as well as UN agencies and bodies, who we hope will be able to shed some light on ways forward based on 2 areas of discussion. First will be the concept of local communities, their self-representation and self-mobilization in the international climate change process. And second will be how to enhance the participation of local communities in addition to Indigenous peoples in the LCIPP, which is what is now short for Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. As most of you know, the Facilitative Working Group for the LCIPP was established last December in Katowice at COP24 with the objectives of furthering the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform and its implementation. The working group facilitates the implementation of the platform's 3 functions, which are knowledge, capacity for engagement, and climate change policies and actions. It's comprised of 14 members, half of which are representatives of parties and half of which represent Indigenous peoples. I'm happy to report on behalf of the Facilitative Working Group that the first meeting of the body that was held this past weekend, 14th to 16th of June, was very successful through equal partnership between Indigenous peoples and states, perhaps a new model in the United Nations system. Pasang Doma Sherpa and Majid Shafipur were elected as the co-chairs, and the vice co-chairs are Rodian Sundianzika and Elvira Gutierrez Barron, which is a leadership balance between Indigenous peoples representatives and state party representatives. Among other outcomes, at the meeting, we worked on a draft 2-year work plan, which we'll finish polishing this week for a presentation to SBSTA 51. So I want to continue as the co-chair, as a member of the Facilitative Working Group at the request of the co-chairs, to provide some additional considerations for the discussion. And I will begin by sharing some of the opening reflections based on points of view expressed by the Indigenous peoples involved in this caucus, in this process, formerly known as the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. We sometimes call it the Indigenous Caucus. And these perspectives are grounded in many years that Indigenous peoples have worked in the UN system, not just in this body, but as an organized constituency beginning in 1977 at the first Indigenous Peoples Conference in Geneva, Switzerland, and extending through 30 years of work on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and at the same time working in other fora besides the human rights bodies, including the UNFCCC. Including the formation of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group at the first Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. And during most of our experience at the UNFCCC, I need to remind you that we were basically, as Indigenous peoples, on the outside, looking in, or barely allowed to observe the negotiations that directly impacted our lives and ways of life. Our calls for recognized participation took the form of many meetings with states, joint statements at the COP session, as well as marches and demonstrations, including in Paris at COP21, when where the LCIPP was agreed. A key element in this discussion pertaining to the topic today and the decision to form the Facilitative Working Group in Katowice was the firm recognition, based on the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that local communities and Indigenous peoples are distinct from each other, distinct constituencies in both rights and identity. Although, of course, as peoples, we do have our own Indigenous local communities that are part of the totality of Indigenous peoples. The discussion today regarding the concept of local communities must be considered in this light. We are discussing this issue in regard to local communities that are distinct from Indigenous peoples. As a long organized global constituency with agreed upon protocols for our representation in this process, Indigenous peoples are aware that there is not currently a clear constituency of self-identified local communities with ties to traditional lifeways and knowledge that has emerged to take part in this process. In that light, Indigenous Peoples Caucus has maintained that we will not attempt to define or provide criteria for what constitutes local communities, just as we would not accept others doing that for us. In our view, the ways that local communities will emerge to request participation in this process based on self-representation and self-mobilization will be up to them when the time comes. Finally, we note that the process and mechanisms for engagement of Indigenous peoples in the LCIPP and the UNFCCC have just begun to take shape with the monumental and historic formation of the Facilitative Working Group, and also what will become the work plan for the LCIPP. In this light, we also see the need to continue discussing ways to build participation of Indigenous peoples in this process, including our traditional knowledge holders, or maybe especially our traditional knowledge holders. And we look forward to doing so in future dialogues. And with those opening remarks, by agreement with my co-chair, I'll proceed to chair session 1. Calling the first speaker to make her presentation, Mrs. Rita Michan. But first I want to turn over for some opening comments by the Secretariat and my co-chair.
Thank you, Andrea. And good afternoon and very warm welcome to this workshop also from my side. Very nice to see you all again, friends and colleagues. I would like to start by thanking the Chief Francois Paulette for the opening ceremony we were just part of, and the Subsidiary Chair and Andrea Carmen on behalf of the Facilitative Working Group for their opening remarks. As the Subsidiary Chair outlined, this workshop will focus on the topic of enhancing the participation of local communities, in addition to Indigenous peoples in the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. In 2021, the SBSTA will undertake a review of the outcomes and activities of the LCIPP, and the COP is to make a decision on this matter at COP27. The COP will take into account progress related to the representation of local communities and will consider whether to expand the composition of the Facilitative Working Group at that point. This workshop, therefore, seeks to learn from the experiences of others on the same topic. Through these shared experiences, we hope we'll be able to learn, deliberate, and develop constructive solutions that have a meaningful impact for our peoples and communities. Transformative change requires innovation, ambition, and collaborative action. I hope that this workshop helps us to work together to achieve our common goal and truly embody our unity of purpose. With that, I would like to give over to the Secretariat, and they will share some background information. And I would also like to thank the Secretariat for organizing the workshop and for their all hard work over the past days. So over to you, Tiffany. Thanks.
Thanks, Anela. Discussion on how the local communities can engage in the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform has been held in previous years under the SBSTA. And during these discussions, the Secretariat's been asked to clarify questions related to the constituency system and how our process works. So we wanted to share that information today as some background for this workshop. Over the years, admitted organizations have formed themselves into groups with diverse but broadly clustered interests and perspectives. To ensure consistency within the wider context of the UN environmental processes, the constituency system mirrors the 9 major groups identified as stakeholders in the Agenda 21 and reiterated in the Rio+20 outcome document. It cites women, children and youth, Indigenous peoples, NGOs, local authorities, workers and trade unions, business and industry, the scientific and technological community, and farmers. Initially, there were two constituencies, business and industry and environmental NGOs. The local government and municipal authorities constituency was recognized at the first COP, and at COP7 in 2001, the Indigenous Peoples Organization's constituency was recognized. Between 2003 and 2011, the other constituencies were then recognized. A request for recognizing the farmers' constituency is under review, while it still operates on a provisional basis. Since 2016, the Secretariat also recognizes two informal groups, faith-based organizations and education and capacity building and outreach NGOs. To have a group recognized, a number of procedural steps need to be undertaken. Just to give a couple of examples, it does require a high degree of self-mobilization, including the creation of a governance structure, focal points, activities undertaken under the UNFCCC process, written applications, and so forth. Through these procedures, the Secretariat assesses the information and makes a decision. I hope that information was useful in the context of this workshop. Thank you, Nella and Andrea.
Thank you, Tiffany. The way we decided to share the work with my co-moderator is that she's going to moderate the first session of this workshop, and then I will cover the second one. So over to you, Andrea.
Thank you to the Secretariat for the important background information to provide context for this discussion. The first session of this working group is discussion on the concept of local communities and their self-representation and self-mobilization in the international climate change process. And our first speaker is Mrs. Rita Machan, the co-chair of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. And we're going to be having 5 to 10 minute presentations by each of our speakers, and then we're going to open up the session to a participatory dialogue. Thank you. Ms. Machan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It is an honor for me to be here today. I thank all of the organizers and the Secretariat for this space and this meeting. I also thank the prayer which we began in this meeting. The PCCB is dedicated to capacity building, and as you all know, the objective of our work plan has been defining and identifying gaps and needs in the activities of implementing the NDCs, the National Determined Commitments in developing countries. In the indigenous peoples and local communities are a key actor in the implementation of NDCs in countries, in developing countries. In some countries, I can speak for my country, I come from Guatemala. In some countries, as Guatemala, they have not been participating in they have not been considered in their participation as an economic force, though they are the ones that have been working the land forever. Their ancestry knowledge is a key factor to learn the ways that used to work for the land. We know that climate change is an effect for not having done the things the right way. The economic development in our countries, in developing countries, have focused on consumption and production, and we know that we have to change the patterns of consumption and production, and indigenous people knowledge can enlighten our way in order to find the way back into the land. Our societies at this time and age of evolution have divorced from the land, and for some reason this divorce stopped listening to the laws of nature, which are the laws that should guide us in order to achieve what the Paris Agreement aims. We need ambition, and we need to, it's like going backwards in time. Backwards in the sense of the evolution has to continue as is, but we have to start listening back to Mother Earth. We need to listen to the knowledge of indigenous people and local communities. There are many ways and there are many examples that this is happening in many of our countries. Some of the projects of RED Plus have given some light into how we can work with local communities, giving them back the ownership of the land and the capacity to be a part of the process, in the sense that the agroproductivity that we are designing in the RED Plus projects can benefit them, as well as the carbon market is going to be doing in the near future. Therefore, I think that the key word that the vice chair of the chair of SBSTA and some of you mentioned is the key word that we forgot in society is solidarity. We forgot that we all have to work hand in hand, listen to one another, and work together for the solutions. Climate change has many challenges ahead of us, and if we don't go back to the original laws of nature, we will not be able to achieve what the Paris Agreement defined. The International Labour Organization has urged Latin American countries to carry out a strategic reorientation of their labour market policies in order to increase productivity and to address rising unemployment and informality resulting from the economic slowdown. But this design of new strategies in increasing productivity should not go against the laws of nature, because the land is drying, the water is polluted, the oceans are also being polluted from the same effects of chemicals in the agro-industry, as well as the pollution in the rivers. Therefore, we have to support these local communities and indigenous people in our countries, in the world. And this platform that has been designed and that has, as you all mentioned, it has taken 30 years to organize them in these efforts of the international effort under the convention UNFCCC. We need to continue supporting their efforts and listening to them louder, in a louder voice, and give them the opportunity to participate in a more formal manner in the official negotiations, in order for everyone to remember what is in our DNA, because we all come from nature. So the laws of nature are within us, but we have stepped away from them, and we need to go back to the laws of nature, and we need to support our local communities and indigenous people in our countries in order to hand in hand be able to find solutions. The productivity as is in the world has to change. We cannot continue just to consume and dry the land and continue the pollution that we have created in our waters. Without water, there is no survival. Without food, there is no survival. And we are coming to a point in time of evolution that these factors have to change. And in order to change, we have to change. We all have to change. Our communities, local communities and indigenous peoples, at least I can speak for my country, they have always listened to the land, and they have complied with the laws of nature, and they have not been taken seriously. Society as is in the governing processes have not taken them into consideration. They have practically use them as a labor force, but without the benefits of the labor force. Therefore, we need to give everyone the respect they deserve and the space they need in the space they have as part of the society in order to be able to enrich our societies, in order to enrich our evolution in the right direction, in order to achieve what our NDCs are aiming in achieving the ambition of the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your participation. Our next speaker to address the engagement of local communities in the context of labor market policies from the International Labor Organization is Mrs. Maria Victoria Cabrera, legal officer in the Indigenous Peoples and Ethnic Minorities team of the ILO. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. First of all, let me express my gratitude for the organizers of this workshop for inviting the ILO to take part to it. I must also start making a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on climate change negotiations, so please I accept my apologies if I lack certain knowledge on all this negotiation process, but my purpose today is to share with you the experience of the ILO with regard to indigenous and tribal peoples based on ILO Convention 169, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, which, as you may know, is so far the only treaty dealing comprehensively with indigenous peoples under international law. The ILO Convention 169 was adopted in 1989. It's an expression of the historical engagement of the ILO with indigenous and tribal peoples. The convention doesn't refer to local communities. There is no ILO instrument referring to local communities as subjects of rights. However, it contains legal criteria for the identification of indigenous and tribal peoples, which are different categories, as I will explain in the course of my presentation. The convention has been ratified by 23 countries so far, and the important thing is that this is an instrument subject to regular supervision. And as I will explain to you, there are some comments that have been provided by supervisory bodies on the question of identification of indigenous and tribal peoples that will be interesting for you to know. So Article 1 of the Convention contains the criteria for the identification of indigenous and tribal peoples. As you can read in the wording of the article, there are basically objective criteria in the first two paragraphs. With respect to tribal peoples, the Convention provides for two objective criteria, basically. The fact that the group has social, cultural, and economic conditions that distinguish them from other sectors of national community, first thing. And second thing, that they are regulated wholly or partially by their own customary laws or by special laws. The second category, indigenous peoples, are regarded as such based on first thing, the historical connection they have with the population that inhabited the territory where they are based before colonialization or conquest, or before the establishment of present state boundaries. And second, the fact of retaining their own social, economic, and political institutions independent of the status that they have in their countries. These are basically the objective criteria. And Article 1 also provides for the subjective criterion, which is very important, and it's the criterion of self-identification, as you can read in the second paragraph of Article 1. And this criterion of self-identification that applies for both indigenous and tribal peoples should be considered as fundamental criterion when determining the subjects covered by Convention 169. Concerning what the supervisory bodies have said on the question of identification, first of all, the supervisory bodies have pointed out the importance of identifying the populations that meet these criteria. This is important for countries in order to better determine the priorities and the agenda for these peoples. Secondly, it has emphasized the importance of using the criterion of self-identification. And it's interesting to know that in some countries, self-identification is used in census to identify the indigenous peoples. This is, for example, the case of Chile. Recently, Chile made a census, and one of the questions for determining the indigenous and tribal peoples was the question of self-identification. In terms of self-practice, there are some countries which have started to develop a registry for indigenous communities. In this regard, it is important to mention that the ILO supervisory bodies have emphasized that registration of a group as indigenous or tribal peoples should not be constitutive, but declaratory. It's in a way that indigenous and tribal peoples are recognized as a pre-existing reality. And the other thing is that courts have also, when invoking the convention, refers to the criterion of self-identification when it comes to determine the existence of indigenous and tribal peoples. In terms of representation, and Convention 169 also provides some important elements to consider. First of all, the convention protects the cultural integrity of indigenous and tribal peoples, including the right of these peoples to retain their practices and institutions, as in accordance with Article 5 of the convention. And in terms of consultation, one of the requirements that the convention establishes for proper consultation is precisely that consultation should be undertaken through the representative institutions of indigenous peoples. And in this regard, it is important to say that the ILO has not defined criteria of what indigenous representation means. However, it has called upon the attention of states to ensure that representative institutions come directly from indigenous peoples, that they themselves define who should represent them. The convention is also rich in terms of provisions on participation. Actually, it's the principle that guides the convention. And there are provisions on participation that might be useful also for the climate change context. First of all, the convention guarantees participation of indigenous peoples at least at the same level of all the rest of the members of the society. But it also contains specific provisions on participation for indigenous peoples. First of all, it provides for the obligation to consult. As you may know, Article 6 of the Convention requires governments to consult with indigenous peoples through their representative institutions and through adequate procedures whenever consideration is being given to laws, administrative or legislative measures that might affect them directly. Also, there is a specific provision on consultation with regard to extractive activities when the government aims to undertake exploitation or exploration of natural resources in indigenous lands. The communities concerned should be consulted. There is also a specific provision that requires governments to cooperate with indigenous peoples and indigenous and tribal peoples in the process of environmental impact assessments. This is actually linked to the right of indigenous peoples to define their own prerogative of development. And finally, it is important to mention that the convention recognizes the specific and special relationship that indigenous peoples have with their lands they have traditionally occupied, And in this regard, it is important to look at the concept of land under Article 13, because land covers not only the territory in question over which the indigenous peoples may have a title, but also the areas that are occupied by indigenous peoples. And this is important in terms of consultation, because if also these areas occupied by indigenous groups or used by indigenous groups that are not specifically recognized as ownership of indigenous peoples, but are affected, then the obligation to consult may arise. This is what I have to say, and I will be happy to answer questions if questions come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very important comments, which I think we'll all take into consideration. And our next speaker, we're moving to civil society organization, MOCAF, Mr. Gustavo Sanchez Valle from the Red Mexicana de Organizaciones Campesinas Forestales, Red MOCAF. Sir, you have the floor.
Gracias. Aprecio muchísimo la oportunidad de compartir nuestra experiencia. También aprecio las palabras de todos los que me han precedido, incluyendo la plegaria que se realizó al inicio. Con esta presentación queremos compartir brevemente desde la experiencia de México que muchas sociedades en América Latina son pluriculturales y que es importante que nos reconozcamos. También vamos a compartir la experiencia de cooperación entre organizaciones de comunidades locales y organizaciones indígenas, y vamos a aportar algunas propuestas para la construcción del concepto de comunidades locales. Perdón, voy a tomar. Soy presidente de una red de una organización que se llama Red MOCAF, y que es una red indígena y comunitaria. Somos organizaciones forestales que tenemos características en común, como por ejemplo una cultura, un territorio, usos y costumbres y un manejo colectivo de los recursos. Enfrentamos tanto indígenas como comunidades casi los mismos problemas y los mismos retos, y como organización tratamos de que los derechos de ambos grupos sean reconocidos y respetados. Quiero comentar sobre el marco jurídico en México. A partir de 1994, cuando hay una rebelión indígena en el sur del país, con el surgimiento del Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, hay una serie de acciones armadas de los indígenas reivindicando sus derechos, hacerse visibles en los diálogos a nivel nacional, y se crea un proceso de construcción de acuerdos con el gobierno que se llamó los Acuerdos de San Andrés. 7 años después hubo una reforma constitucional en materia de derechos humanos y de pueblos indígenas. Si bien los diálogos entre el gobierno y el EZLN no llegaron a buen término, la reforma constitucional ha significado un gran avance en el marco jurídico mexicano. A partir de esta reforma, el artículo 2 de la Constitución mexicana reconoce 3 grupos: pueblos indígenas, que retoma algunos de los elementos del convenio 169, comunidades indígenas, y un tercer grupo que se llama comunidades equiparables, es decir, comunidades con características similares a las comunidades indígenas, pero que no pertenecen a algún pueblo indígena, y la Constitución les reconoce los mismos derechos. A partir de esta reforma constitucional, las organizaciones indígenas y comunitarias hemos logrado impulsar una serie de reformas en las leyes secundarias, como es la ley forestal. Por ejemplo, hemos logrado que se acepte el concepto de manejo forestal comunitario como aquel manejo que realizan de manera colectiva tanto comunidades indígenas como comunidades locales. También hemos logrado que se incorpore en la ley forestal un artículo sobre salvaguardas sociales y ambientales y que protegen tanto a indígenas como a comunidades locales de acciones que podrían representar un riesgo. Dentro de estas salvaguardas están el consentimiento libre, previo e informado, el reconocimiento y respeto de las formas internas de organización y autodeterminación y el reconocimiento y respeto de prácticas culturales tradicionales. En cuanto a espacios de participación ciudadana, se ha creado el Consejo Nacional Forestal, de acuerdo precisamente a esta ley forestal, y establece diversas representaciones de diferentes sectores, entre ellas un lugar para pueblos indígenas y otro para comunidades forestales. Estas dos representaciones hemos formado una mesa de trabajo para aspectos como la consulta de la Estrategia Nacional Red. Y ambos sectores nos coordinamos para promover propuestas de política pública, reformas a las leyes, reglamentos y programas gubernamentales. Un caso especial ha sido la consulta de la Estrategia Nacional Red, que se llevó a cabo en 2015-2016, donde las representaciones indígenas y de comunidades nos unimos para negociar con el gobierno mexicano que la consulta fuera con los estándares más altos, es decir, los del convenio 169, y que incluía acuerdos previos con el gobierno de cómo iba a ser la consulta, una etapa de información previa hacia las comunidades, tiempo para deliberar internamente y construcción de una posición en conjunto y al final la negociación de acuerdos con el gobierno federal. En esta lámina tenemos parte de los materiales que realizamos para la etapa de información previa. Juntos, pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales, elaboramos materiales que fueron distribuidos tanto en español como en lenguas indígenas. El que se ve del lado derecho es un folleto en náhuatl, que es una de las lenguas más difundidas en México, pero se realizaron en otras lenguas. Bien, finalmente lo que queremos señalar es que en el marco jurídico mexicano hay un reconocimiento tanto de pueblos indígenas como de otras comunidades y que estos dos sectores tenemos intereses comunes, enfrentamos los mismos retos y nos estamos coordinando para enfrentarlos. Tenemos algunas propuestas hacia una definición de comunidades locales. Creemos que son aquellos sujetos colectivos que tienen algunas o la mayoría de las siguientes características. Por ejemplo, una identidad social, actividades económicas en común, identidad cultural, un territorio en común que puede ser en propiedad, en posesión o en uso, un manejo colectivo del territorio, de sus recursos, sus conocimientos, y autoridades, representaciones, organizaciones o gobiernos de acuerdo a usos y costumbres o a regulaciones internas. Finalmente, queremos expresarles un saludo por parte de varias organizaciones de América Latina interesadas en participar en este proceso, como es, además de Red Mocaf en México, está la Asociación de Comunidades Forestales de Guatemala en Petén, la Alianza Nacional de Organizaciones de Forestería Comunitaria de Guatemala, la Federación de Productores Agroforestales de Honduras y el Proceso de Comunidades Negras de Colombia. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias por tu presentación tan interesante. This presentation and all the other presentations are being collected by the Secretariat and will be passed on to the members of the Facilitating Working Group for consideration. And our final presenter, before we open up the topic for comments from the body, the floor, is John Scott, Manager of the Peoples and Biodiversity Unit, focal point for Indigenous peoples and local communities for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And he'll be joining us on Skype. We're waiting for just a moment to bring him online. And after this, I want to remind you, we will open up the floor for other comments before we go on to the next session, which will be co-chaired by my co-chair, Anela, from the Secretariat. And so people can prepare any comments, observations, or information that they may want to share. John, are you there?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Oh, hello. How are you?
Good to know you're there.
It's good to know you there too. Well, we'll turn over the floor to John Scott. I'm not sure what the technical arrangements are, but we welcome our old friend John. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carmen. And it's great to know that there's some people there with a lifetime of experience in the Indigenous movement, and that may help us in our discussion about local communities today. So I'd like to talk mainly about local communities, and the Convention on Biological Diversity has probably done the most work on this, although there's some other bodies also working on the issue of local communities, which I'll mention in my presentation. So let me talk about the importance of engaging both Indigenous peoples and local communities. You know, the Convention uses the acronym Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities. And in general, local communities and Indigenous peoples work together under the Convention for similar goals. I want to talk about some of the major guidance we have, particularly about local communities, and then some conclusions. So, of course, I think we know why local action and collective actions are extremely valuable for the goals of the Convention on Biodiversity. The world is facing a sixth extinction crisis. We're facing climate change, and the most vulnerable populations, and also ironically the most resilient populations, are Indigenous peoples and local and traditional communities, those who are living close to biodiversity. Some local community elders said in the Caribbean, if you don't use traditional knowledge for ecosystem management, you will make mistakes. And if you don't engage Indigenous peoples and local communities in the implementation of the Convention, it's a great missed opportunity. So let me continue. Under the Convention, and forgive me for using the acronym IPLCs within the context of the CBD, but IPLCs are regarded as different from stakeholders. They are rights holders under the Convention and also under the access and benefit sharing regime established by the Nagoya Protocol. So when we talk about IPLCs and stakeholders, we don't talk about IPLCs and other stakeholders because they're not stakeholders. This is a very important legal nuance that we need to ensure is consistent across the multilateral environmental conventions. This gives talks about, of course, the role Indigenous peoples and local communities are currently lobbying. At the moment, they have an official role as observers, but they have enhanced participation mechanisms. What Indigenous peoples and local communities are lobbying for in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is a recognition of special status as partners in implementing the Convention. So I think that's very important for our discussion today. Now, I also do a lot of work with UNESCO on biological and cultural diversity. And of course, now we have 1.6 billion people on Earth. And Indigenous peoples are about 5% of the world population. Across the world, we have 5,000 different cultures across 90 countries at least. Now, Indigenous peoples and local communities represent by far the largest portions of linguistic and cultural diversity on Earth, and maps that show linguistic and cultural diversity over the top of biological diversity demonstrate that all these things are linked. In fact, it's Indigenous peoples and local communities' traditional lands and waters that maintain most of the Earth's remaining biological diversity. So, of course, we need to engage them. The international community must engage them. Okay. Now, local and collective actions, of course, for a sustainable future and the goals of the convention, but also we're encouraging the governments of the world to embrace the power of local actions and collective actions and to learn from communities who have lived sustainably for millennia. So for the convention, we're saying that it's time to unleash the full potential of Indigenous peoples and local communities and welcome them fully into the CBD family. And this is particularly important in the next 16 months as we're developing and adopting in China next October at the CBD COP15, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will be our 30-year plan for saving life on Earth, 2020 to 2050. So so far, and part of my job is doing progress reports and studying the national reports and the submissions. And I have to say that countries are not fully engaging Indigenous peoples and local communities in the on-the-ground implementation of the convention. And for me, this is a great missed opportunities for the governments of the world, especially at the local level. Indigenous peoples and local communities are on-site in situ communities actively pursuing conservation and sustainable use and directly contributing to the effective implementation of the convention. Now, traditional knowledge along with science has proven an effective knowledge base for species and ecosystem management by establishing and managing community protected areas and Indigenous peoples protected areas. So more and more traditional knowledge, different knowledge systems are being brought together for the best possible base for local ecosystem management. Now, realized opportunities. Indigenous and community conservation areas are a great shining light for future work. In places like Australia, Indigenous protected areas are 9% of the 17% of the national protected areas estate. So Indigenous peoples in Australia are managing more than half of the country's protected areas. And I have some examples there. Now, of course, I'll leave you with this PowerPoint, but I want to get on to our more focused discussion on local communities. The current target for the CBD for next year for traditional knowledge is that it's respected and fully implemented into, fully reflected in the implementation of the convention. And we have 4 indicators for traditional knowledge, and that is linguistic diversity, Indigenous languages, changes in land use and secure tenure of land. Also, the enjoyment of traditional occupations, and also the full and effective participation of IPLCs in the revision of the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and in drafting of the national reports. Now, these are ways, of course, that IPLCs participate. In the working group on 8J, which I manage, and the 11th meeting will happen in November in Montreal, Indigenous peoples and local communities have enhanced participation mechanisms and can speak on a par with governments. They also nominate an Indigenous caucus, which works with the government bureau to manage the meeting. So the official guidance on reporting is that Indigenous peoples should be involved in drafting the official reports. sorry, I just want to skip through this to the work on IPLC participation, okay, conclusions. I'm not sure if okay. Of course, maybe I will stop the PowerPoint and go straight to the discussion on local communities. Local communities in the CBD, Indigenous peoples have managed to, local communities have manifested themselves at the CBD. And as far back as 2012, we had an expert group meeting. And when we first asked, when local communities first asked the governments for a expert group meeting on local communities, the government said to local communities, who would be the experts? And the local communities responded, we would be. Local community representatives would be the experts on local communities. Now, we brought together some 30 people, which also included a number of governments, St. Lucia, Samoa, South Africa, Madagascar, Bangladesh, India, which also was interested in the discussion about local communities. Now, from that expert group meeting, a report went to the COP, and it recommended that we make space for local communities. In the CBD, since the very beginning, we had the words, the phrase Indigenous and local communities, because we didn't want to leave out anybody who had local environmental knowledge that was useful for the goals of the convention. And we also recognize that some Indigenous peoples were not recognized as such by the governments. So if we just said Indigenous peoples, we could potentially also lock out unrecognized Indigenous peoples. So for us, local communities and Indigenous peoples have been two overlapping circles. Sometimes they can be quite distinct. Sometimes there's a mixed ground in common. For instance, the African descendant communities in Brazil, some of them are, of course, of African and Indigenous descendant. They identify not as Indigenous, but as local or traditional communities. So my point is, I guess, and many of the Indigenous peoples in the room have worked on human rights, is when we're talking about equal rights for others, it doesn't mean that there's less of the pie for you. That's not how human rights works. So I would encourage you to share space with local communities and do it in a cooperative way. At the same time, I very much agree with Andrea that local communities need to manifest themselves and participate, so they have a right to self-identify and to effectively participate in matters that affect them. And I don't know if there's any local communities in the room now. In fact, I would recommend that you do outreach to encourage local communities to have this discussion, because local communities need to be at the table now when you're having a discussion specifically about their participation. So that's one point I would leave you with. Certainly, we need to cast a wide net in looking for partners to save life on Earth, if that's our ambition, to live in harmony with nature by 2050. So we need both Indigenous peoples at the table, we need local and traditional communities at the table, and but at the same time, in a very practical way, Indigenous peoples and local communities under the convention have always worked together. As an Indigenous person myself, who was involved with the drafting of the UN Declaration, I was a report writer for the working group on the UN Declaration with Mrs. Dias, the chief draftee and chairperson. And what I know from the early days of the Indigenous movement, going back to 1982, is Martinez Cobo was the UN bureaucrat in human rights that delayed the report against discrimination against Indigenous populations for 6 years, so that Indigenous peoples had a chance in the early 1980s to manifest themselves and develop an international identity, so that we could then come to UN meetings and represent ourselves. Now, my observations of local communities is that they are where the Indigenous movement was at in the early 1980s. So it's an international movement in its infancy. At the same time, there is an emerging human rights framework developing around local communities, which is distinct from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that includes things like the recent Peasants Declaration, also the work of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Agriculture, on the rights of small farmers, which can be both Indigenous peoples or local communities, in particular women. And now the Permanent Forum at its last session has put out a very interesting, I'm trying to find it, put out a very interesting recommendation to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare, in consultation with other UN entities, including the Secretariat of the Convention on Biodiversity, a comparative legal study that analyzes the rights of Indigenous peoples and the emerging rights of local communities. So this is actually a recommendation that to do a comparative legal study. From what I've seen of the emerging instruments around local community rights, for me the big difference with the UN Declaration is particularly the pre-colonial societies, pre-settler, although I don't like that word, settler societies, and also a much stronger attachment to place in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that's the observations I would make at this time about the different legal frameworks. For now, I think it's necessary to open the door, to do outreach, to make sure local communities are at the table. But I would not go as far as to have separate facilities or separate badges or different things until sufficient numbers manifest themselves that make this a logical process. So it does rely on people, local community representatives, manifesting themselves. Now, one last example I'll leave you with is I manage a voluntary fund for Indigenous peoples and local community participation in meetings held under the Convention on Biodiversity. Now, if I get 100 Indigenous peoples applying and I get 10 local community people applying, I can probably choose 9 or 10 Indigenous and 1 local community, because it depends on how many applications you get in the first place. So it would, for me, it would not be equitable to get 100 Indigenous applications, to get 10 local community applications, but to bring 10, and then to bring all 10 local community participants and only 10 Indigenous. So for me, determining equity with things like this depends on how many applicants you get in the first place, and then following the guidelines to fund a balanced group. So I hope I've left you with some thought-provoking things. I think that we're going to continue to see the human rights framework for local communities developing, and but I always like to think these are two at least slightly overlapping circles. There are some people who get caught in the middle. So I don't see them I don't see it as completely black and white. It's just that human diversity is much more complex than that. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Very interesting examples you provided from the CBD perspective. That concludes our prepared speakers, and I want to thank all of them for very interesting contributions. Now we're going to open up the floor to anyone here, not just UN bodies, for brief comments. I hope you can keep your comments to a couple of minutes, or questions for the speakers, and we'll see how many we get, but I think we can take about 15 or 20 minutes before we go on to the next subject, because we started late. So I don't want to cut anybody off that wants to express themselves, and the Secretariat is going to help us identify speakers. So if you have a flag in front of you, put it up, please. If not, then just raise your hand and the Secretariat will try to keep track and provide me with a list of speakers. Thank you. Indonesia, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair and Co-Chair, as well as the distinguished colleagues of the UNFCCC Secretariat. Thank you very much for the opportunity. First and foremost, please allow me to convey my highest appreciation and congratulations on behalf of the government of Indonesia to SBSTA Chair and Co-Chair of the LCIPP as well as the UNFCCC Secretariat for their tireless effort in extending their support as well as facilitation for the realization of the fruitful first meeting of the Facilitative Working Group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, which has been taken place on 14 to 16 June 2019 in Bonn. Indonesia has been a proponent of involving local communities, notwithstanding with the lack of modalities for their formal representation. We therefore look forward to the outcomes of this workshop. Furthermore, in Indonesia, local communities play key roles in climate action. In our efforts to rehabilitate 2 million hectares of peatland by 2020, we have managed to rehabilitate approximately 680,000 hectares. This progress would not have been achieved without the active participation of local communities who work and reside in peatland areas. Our success in significantly reducing forest and peatland fires is due to local communities changing their land clearing methods. The new methods being used actually were taken from certain practices of particular local communities, and we have been able to teach and replicate those sustainable methods to other communities. Their contribution to climate action is real and concrete. Indonesia proposes that the LCIPP leaves the door wide open for local community representation, whether they are farming, coastal, peatland, or forest communities, of whom are most vulnerable to climate change. While we respect civil society autonomy and independence in determining their own representation, we suggest we apply flexibility for governments to invite their local community to be active partners in LCIPP. Thank you.
Thank you. Costa Rica.
Thank you very much, co-facilitators, and to the presenter for their good presentations. I just wanted to try to focus a little bit more the challenge that we have ahead, and what is the reason of the main reason for the workshop, and is how to identify ways to enhance the participation of local communities. And somehow this is the result of a general understanding among the group that has been discussing the issue of the platform in the previous session, that we don't have clarity on the legal elements that are surrounding all this discussion on local communities, because we have realized somehow that it has different interpretation in different legal and national contexts, and there is not a common understanding neither of the concept, neither of the participation process in terms of becoming a constituency recognized at the global level, in particular in the context of the UNFCCC. I can say from the Costa Rican perspective that we still have that problem. We don't have any legal framework on local communities from the perspective, for instance, of the ILO Convention. But of course, we have local communities that are organized for different purposes, at different geographies, with different type of approaches and so on. And we have different participation mechanisms for the civil society groups, depending if we are talking about forestry policy, biodiversity policy, climate policy, and so on. So there are also regulations to allow the participation of local and regional, so to say, development agencies in the country that probably are looking for a specific aim, like improving water management, infrastructure in their specific populations, and so on. But in terms of climate policy, and we have recently adopted through an executive decree, we created the National Citizens Council for Climate Change, which includes 21 representatives from different sectors of the economy and that represent different interests of many people of the environment and sustainable development community that are closely related with climate change. So this is the way we have been able to, promote and provide a legal framework for the participation of the different sectors, not just, a very strict concept of local communities, in climate action in particular, to design and implement our NDC. So, and in my view, we need to, it was interesting, the presentation by the CBD, but I still feel like we don't have clarity. I don't know what the concept they use, to say that, 5% of the population, of the global population, is indigenous and local communities. Probably the concept can provide us more light on that regard. But also, I'm not sure or fully clear on my understanding on how the UNF, in the context of the UNFCCC, how clear is the concept of local communities as part of the constituencies recognized, or to participate in those processes. And I think we need to start by addressing these, critical and basic elements. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that's why we're having this conversation. So the lady next to him in the red shirt, I'm very sorry, I don't know your name. If you could introduce yourself, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Paula Joya. I'm a smallholder farmer in a community farm here in Germany. Thanks for the chance to speak. I am here today in representation of La Via Campesina, the global peasants movement, which gathers over 200 million peasants, smallholder farmers, rural women, rural youth, some fishers, and also pastoralists from 182 local organizations in all continents of the globe. And many of our members identify themselves as peasants and as indigenous communities, indigenous people at the same time. Most of our members have been living for generations in their traditional territories with their local communities, with their local communities working with traditional practices, promoting biodiversity, taking care of our soil, waters, seeds, and planet as a whole, carrying their cultural and social traditions, their spiritualities. We have been informed by Bolivia on the process towards this platform and are very keen to get more engaged in the discussions and hopefully also in the process. La Via Campesina was born in the early 90s from the need to coordinate actions to defend an agriculture model that is respectful to the environment and is based on human rights. Food sovereignty and local control over the food system is central to our struggle, as is solidarity with the victims of corporate agribusiness and the climate crisis they have caused. The current agriculture model being carried over the last 50 years is misguiding food production. Since the Green Revolution, the dominant credo is mechanization, productivity, and growth. No matter the price, society, especially local communities, pay for it. Food turned to a commodity. Traditional peasants' communities have been displaced in order to make place for industrial agriculture, which is one of the main drivers of the climate heating we have been increasingly facing. 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the industrial food system. Land use chains, production, transformation, packaging, refrigeration, transportation, and waste. All this contributes to social destruction of local peasant communities, to the rural exodus, and to migration. At the same time, there are several studies showing that peasant agroecology, with its holistical practices and its local food chains, would be able to really address climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions between half and 1/4 within few decades. We, as La Via Campesina, have been actively involved in the UNFCCC process for many years, including, but not limited to, the COP21 in Paris. We believe that climate justice is possible through peasants' agroecology and food sovereignty. Recently, the UN adopted the resolution 73/165 on the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas, shortly UNDROP, during the 73rd session of the UNGA last December. This was a milestone for us peasants in the world, being recognized as right holders and at the same time as victims of structural discriminations and human rights violations, while we are the ones feeding over 70% of the world's population, using only 30% of the natural resources. In its first article, the paragraph 1 of the UNDROP, it's well defined who are the right holders of the declaration. And here a short quote: "A peasant is any person who engages or who seeks to engage alone or in association with others or as a community in small-scale agricultural production for subsistence and or for the market, and who relies significantly, though not necessarily exclusively, on family or household labor and other non-monetized ways of organizing labor, and who has a special dependence on and attachment to the land." The UNDROP addresses rights of peasants to natural resources, such as land and water, as well as to a clean environment. For all these reasons, Chair, La Via Campesina believes that the inclusion of peasants as local communities in the LCIPP platform would make justice to our history, to the impacts we face within the current system, and to the role that we play together with indigenous peoples' communities to feed humanity and to protect nature, environment, and Mother Earth as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, please, if you have prepared remarks, please make sure to send them to the secretariat so they can be considered as part of the product. We have to move on to the other session. However, we have 2 additional speakers that have asked for the floor and a question coming from our online mechanism here. So I would like to call on the government of Ecuador to speak, and then after that, Yao, from a member of the Facilitative Working Group from Micronesia, We had a specific question for John Scott as well, and a question from a remote participant. We also, okay, Cameroon also. Remember, we have another whole session with speakers and a dialogue at the end of that also. And I'd like to ask you, please, to keep your interventions as short as possible to give the maximum opportunity for everyone. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Voy a hablar en español. Primero que nada, agradecer la organización de este taller que realmente va a aportar muchísimo en cuanto al impulso que debe haber para la participación de las comunidades locales en la plataforma. Asimismo, agradecerle al Chief Paulette por esa oración que dio al principio. Realmente nos cala hondo esas palabras en vista de que son en pro de el cuidado de nuestra madre tierra. Simplemente y brevemente quiero contarles cómo se trata realmente a las comunidades locales en el Ecuador. Indicarles primero que a nivel constitucional el Estado ecuatoriano se reconoce como plurinacional intercultural. Y en este sentido, la Constitución reconoce varios derechos específicos a los pueblos y las nacionalidades, como son el reconocimiento de la justicia indígena, la inclusión de los derechos de las comunidades, pueblos y nacionalidades, para mantener, desarrollar y fortalecer libremente su identidad, sentido de pertenencia, tradiciones ancestrales y formas de organización social. Además, compartirles que en el 2014 se constituyó el Consejo Nacional para la Igualdad de Pueblos y Nacionalidades, que agrupa a las nacionalidades indígenas, pueblos montubios y afroecuatorianos con el objetivo de promover su implementación de las políticas destinadas a garantizar la igualdad de las personas, comunas, comunidades, pueblos, nacionalidades y colectivos, y erradicar actos de costumbres, estereotipos y fusiones de discriminación, entre otros. Yo les cuento esto también para comentarles la participación de los pueblos y nacionalidades de la Amazonía del Ecuador muy activamente en el foro de negociación que nos ocupa. Sin embargo, todavía nos falta en nuestro territorio agrupar a las comunidades que son de otras regiones del Ecuador. Por ejemplo, las regiones costeras del Ecuador, donde ahí hay, por ejemplo, los montubios y los afrodescendientes, y también las comunidades de la sierra, de la parte alta, de las montañas del Ecuador. Es definitivamente un reto para nosotros. Quisiéramos que ellos también aporten a la construcción internacional de este nuevo espacio de comunicación y de intercambio. Y queremos expresar específicamente en este espacio que quisiéramos que el ahondar en el concepto de las localidades, de las comunidades locales y su participación en la plataforma para nosotros es muy importante y quisiéramos que se mantenga abierto. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. We have just 3 more speakers, and then we're going to allow the presenters from this session to briefly respond, including John Scott, who got a direct question from the government of Costa Rica. I'd like to ask Yao to take the floor. He is a member of the Facilitative Working Group for the Small Island States from Micronesia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I have a question actually for Mr. John Scott. I found his presentation very useful, especially in terms of the work of the Article 8J working group. And so I understand that in 2011, there was an experts meeting that produced recommendations on possible identifications of local communities and how to enhance their participation. And I'm just curious how those recommendations have been received among parties in the CBD. Are there any particular criticisms? Have they kind of not been ignored? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And John, you have 2 questions now. We'll come back around to the presenters at the end. I have the government of Cameroon, and then the European Union will be the last to speak on this open dialogue section.
Thank you very much. My name is Tabi Joda. I'm an indigenous person from Wedikum in Cameroon. And I've been so pleased to be part of this by some coincidence. And the discussions have been really, really so amazing. But I wish to ask, you all know that Africa is at the center of many of the global disasters and many of the climate crises. And the indigenous people of Africa are increasingly at risk of this convergence of climate crisis and disasters. But where is the role of the indigenous people of Africa in these discussions? And of course, in the facilitating working groups that I understand exist. I may be wrong, but permit me to ask that question, because I think where the trouble of the world lies, there is also solution. And the solutions are really not recognized, that the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous science that exists within us, including me, especially the indigenous science that exists in the ecosystem reviving, revival or revolution that exists in the biodiversity. You cannot take this knowledge from us, and you cannot have it. Only we have this knowledge. Until you bring us close, until you recognize that we have this knowledge, and you respect this knowledge, and this knowledge becomes very important. Otherwise, we will be jumping over another solution, which is very, very important at this stage. So I am requesting that let's not forget the role of the indigenous people of Africa in these discussions. The knowledges are vast as much as the problems are vast, but the little that we can contribute at this stage, do not make the mistake to jump over it. It is very valuable. It constitutes the sustainable solutions that the world needs. I can just give you a 30-second example, please. In the last 4 years, we have a community in Achatugi that was completely destroyed because of the demand for forest wood and forest timber. After this community was destroyed, many of our indigenous people were driven away, were moved away. But the government and the people and the modern society tried to restore this landscape and bring the people back. It would never worked until we ourselves had to come back to this community and bring ourselves together as indigenous people. And we were able to restore 77 hectares of this degraded land in 4 years. But this secret lies with us. So the whole global system that has lost so much of its vital ecosystem, its vital biodiversity, call the indigenous people, get the indigenous science and the indigenous knowledge. I bet you the solutions will be very quick and smart and very sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statement. Just a point of information, there are actually 3 members of the Facilitative Working Group from Africa, 2 states representing Africa region and also least developed states. And the indigenous representative is Hindu Ibrahim, who is at this session. I don't know if she's in the room here. I don't see her, but she is at this session of the SBSTA, so it might be a good idea for you to speak with her about how you and your indigenous people or organization could get involved through her participation. I have one more speaker under this session, which is the European Union. And then we will move on to very brief final comments by our speakers for this section of the discussion. And John Scott got 2 questions. So, do we need the online question too? Okay, sorry. We'll do European Union, then the online question. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I think this workshop is another milestone under the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform that was established a couple of years ago. Over the last years, we negotiated the details of this platform that was created in Paris and that reached an important milestone in Katowice with the establishment of the Facilitative Working Group and its mandate. During this negotiating process, we faced the fact that the Indigenous Peoples Caucus was a very well organized organization and very well connected in this process. And we were able to work with them really to find solutions and find agreements to put in place, I think, what was an unprecedented body under this convention, where Indigenous peoples representatives and parties can speak with each other on an equal status. However, we had difficulty in finding the same interlocutor on behalf of local communities and during this process. And both parties and Indigenous peoples representatives agreed in Katowice that it would be important to do an effort to try to enhance the involvement of local communities in this platform, and decided to organize this workshop. And I think this is another milestone, and I think also it's very good that local communities, representatives and organizations are present here, are coming forward and taking the floor. We think that this involvement of local communities needs to emerge organically, basically, and needs probably the time that was also needed for the Indigenous peoples organizations to organize themselves and to connect to the platform. And it's very difficult, and it's also not I mean, we don't think it's a good idea to impose this or whatever. This should really be something that grows bottom up. And in that sense, I would like to stress that we also think that it's important that the self-selection and self-representation of local communities in this process is like an important criterion to make this really say function and do what it's meant to do. So we are looking forward to further engage with both local communities and Indigenous peoples to make from this platform a success that can help to enhance climate action with the involvement of these 2 important groups of stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Secretariat could read the online comment, and then I'll ask each of the speakers for this session to give a very brief 1 to 2 minute closing remarks and move on to the next section. Thank you.
We have a question from our online webcast to the German General. The platform sounds like a fertile ground for collaboration between local communities and Indigenous peoples. It also presents an inclusive space for communities whose countries do not recognize Indigenous peoples. How can we not define but encourage local communities to self-mobilize and participate in this platform?
Was the question directed to someone in particular?
No, it's just...
That may be a good question for all of our speakers to utilize to make their closing remarks for this session. And also just to recall again, John Scott got 2 specific questions about the CBD process that he should answer in the closing remarks. So
Andrea,
I will
what was
go
the 2 questions?
one by one of our speakers. to see if they would like to make closing remarks, and please be brief so we can get on to the next panel. Ms. Rita Mashan, would you like to make a closing comment?
Just very briefly, Madam Chair, thank you very much to all the presentations. I think that there are certain key factors that we must take under consideration, and it has been said, enhancing traditional knowledge is a must. We need to evaluate seriously the lessons learned from the past. In order to have more participation, international participation of the local communities and indigenous people, we have to open and broaden the platform and the participation of local communities in the international arena. In order to be able to make life sustainable on Earth, we need to continue supporting these processes. We understand that multilateralism is a very slow process, but we have gotten here, and this is a good lesson that we must learn from, and also take under consideration the human right factor of the local communities and indigenous people is also a must. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Maria Cabrera.
I have 3 points to make very briefly. First of all, just to highlight that self-identification has been emphasized as regard definition or criteria for the definition of indigenous peoples and local communities. So I think there is something which should be kept in this process of defining local communities. Second thing, I think from the ILO perspective, it's important to again call to the attention the fact that the ILO speaks not only about indigenous but also about tribal peoples, and there have been cases of ratifying countries in which some communities, Afro-descendant communities, have not been regarded as indigenous people, and the ILO have, the ILO supervisory bodies have said that, well, but they meet the criteria for tribal people, so this is another category that one should look at. And finally, just to say that given the fact that indigenous peoples have gone far in terms of developing international legal frameworks for their rights, and also countries have also advanced in laws and policies, one should for sure take the indigenous people's experience into account for the creation of a legal framework for local communities, and the ILO would be very happy to provide experience on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gustavo Sánchez Valle, your closing comments.
Sí, gracias. Quisiera comentar que yo confío en que bajo el principio de autorrepresentación, en las próximas reuniones de la convención, tanto en Costa Rica como en Chile, se puedan propiciar reuniones de las organizaciones de comunidades locales que estemos interesados en participar en el proceso, y que la toma de decisión de esta representación o de esta constitución no lleve demasiado tiempo para incorporarse a la plataforma. También creo que, aunque parezca una cuestión logística, el tema del servicio de traducción es fundamental. Agradezco que en este caso la Secretaría haya facilitado que hubiera el servicio. Sin embargo, en las discusiones del grupo de trabajo, mucha gente, digamos, no participa por la barrera del idioma. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And just to comment that issue has been also noted by the members of the Facilitative Working Group, in particular the Indigenous members. So thank you for reiterating that comment. Okay, the final closing comments will pass to John Scott from the CBD. to answer the questions and make whatever other closing remarks you want to before we pass on to the next topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Andrea, you said there were two questions. There's one I heard from Costa Rica about how have governments responded to the work on local communities, but I didn't get the second question.
It was from Yao from Micronesia.
Okay, can you remind me of that?
It related to the 2011 expert meeting and what was the outcome, if that could be provided. And he's speaking, I think, also as a member of the Facilitative Working Group for our information. Do you want to reiterate your question, Yao? Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my question was about the recommendations from that expert meeting, and I'm wondering what the feedback or the reactions were from the contracting parties, from the CBD contracting parties to those recommendations, if they were implemented in any way, if there were any criticisms. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Actually, both the questions have the same kind of answer, and that is, how did the governments respond to the expert group meeting and the proposals made by the expert group meeting? And there was a balanced group of governments at that meeting, but the majority were local community representatives. And they came out with firstly, they, following the Indigenous position, they are not looking to define local communities. They came up with a list of common characteristics of local communities so that it is a conceptual level. So there's no definition. We really try and avoid definitions just as Indigenous peoples did. There's a danger once we agree on definitions, you can freeze people out that you want at the table. Now, the parties to the convention and the governments in the room, many of the governments in your room are members of the convention. We have 196 governments and the European Union. In decision 1212 back in quite a few years ago, they made the following decision. I'm going to read it very quickly to you about local communities. It recognizing the involvement of local communities in accordance with HA has been limited. Recognizing also the full and effective participation of local communities is crucial for achieving the objectives of the convention, the strategic plan, the HA targets. And then they go on to make 4 paragraphs, and I will send these to the Secretariat so that people can see what the governments agreed to under the CBD many years ago. And this is encouraging governments to take concrete actions to facilitate the participation of local communities in the development and implementation of national biodiversity strategies and action plans and other work under the convention. Also to take a note with appreciation of the report of the expert group meeting and encourages parties to consider the report as useful input to promote the full and effective participation of local communities. And sorry, just to give you a summary, also takes note of the characteristics listed in the annex to the expert report as useful advice in identifying local communities within the mandate of the convention. And it also encourages the Executive Secretary to take practical steps to ensure that local communities have equitable access to the voluntary fund, as well as capacity building workshops, and to commence desegregation of data and statistics on local community representatives. And we report on those in our progress reports every 2 years. And finally, it took note with appreciation sections 2 and 3 of the annex of the expert group meeting report, which provided advice about developing measures and mechanisms, particularly that outreach to local communities. So I'll be very happy to send this decision through to the Secretariat. My view is, at this stage in the development of the local community and Indigenous peoples platform, keep the door open for local communities. Also improve your outreach, because there are local communities out there. I can share the people that are involved in the CBD. So keep the door open, give them space and give them time to manifest themselves. And Also, to remind you that the IPPES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is not using the term traditional knowledge, it's using Indigenous and local knowledge. And there is even a discussion on whether Indigenous and local knowledge is two different things. So this discussion about Indigenous and local is going on in other areas. Keep your eye on the Permanent Forum, which has asked human rights and other agencies in the CBD to develop a comparative legal study on the emerging legal framework for local communities compared to the UN Declaration and ILO 169. So that should also share some light on the nuances, I don't want to say differences, but the legal nuances in looking at Indigenous people's rights and local community rights. But if our aim is to save life on Earth, the conventions to stop the 6th extinction crisis, and the climate change, of course, to address climate change through climate action, we need the door open for all those communities that are on the ground, those communities that suffer most from the loss of biodiversity and climate change. So let's keep the door wide open for local communities and give them a chance to develop, just the way Indigenous peoples had our opportunity to develop how many years ago? 1982, a long time ago, 30, 50 years ago. So, and I'll stop with that. Thank you. And I'll forward all these relevant documents to the Secretariat to share as they see fit, including the expert group meeting report, the COP decision. But it would be good if we can learn from each other across the UN system, particularly on this work on local communities. I'm aware at UNEO a couple of years ago, it came up as a big political issue. Local communities, who are they? There's no advice on this. When in fact the CBD has produced advice on this and done extensive work on this 8 or 9 years ago. So it would be nice if we can all learn from each other and keep our channels open on these matters. So thank you so much. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to present to you electronically, and I really appreciate you giving me this space. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. We'll move on to the next session, which will be introduced and moderated by my co-chair, Anela. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. When the first session was exploring the concept of local communities and their self-representation and self-mobilization in the international climate change processes, then our second session will look how to enhance the participation of local communities in addition to Indigenous peoples in the LCIPP. So we will have 3 speakers and we have only 40 minutes left until the end of this workshop. I urge the speakers to be as concise and brief as possible, so that we'll have a little bit time for some questions. And with that, I would like to invite Grace Balaberg from the Teba Foundation, the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education, to take the floor for her intervention. Grace.
Okay, thank you very much, Anela, and thank you very much, Andrea, as well, for facilitating this. Good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for being here in this interactive dialogue. This is really a very good opportunity for us to learn from each other. And I don't think we can respond to how to enhance the participation, but maybe we will have a continuing dialogue on how to really do this. I would just like to deal on a couple of points that I would like to emphasize. There is a big difference on the participation of Indigenous peoples, considering that we have the legal framework, as already mentioned by others. We have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and of course we have the ILO 169, which provides legal framework minimum standards that we want to be achieved in relation to this. And on the other hand, for local communities, even at the country level, I think there is a requisite on the national legal framework on the recognition as well of local communities, and at the same time on their tenure rights on whatever ecosystems they are sustaining and managing, like the forests, the agricultural lands, or the coastal areas. And of course, we are not the ones who will, while we are very supportive on enhancing the participation of local communities in the LCIPP platform, the indigenous peoples are not the ones who will be defining this for them, as already emphasized by our other earlier speakers. I would just like to reiterate the basic principle of self-identification on who are the indigenous peoples, who are the local communities, and they are the ones who will define that they are local communities, and at the same time the basis for being such. And the other thing I think is very important, as also mentioned by our friend from the European Union, is the organizational mechanisms on how they will be able to identify the representatives in these engagement processes from the national to global level, maybe, or at various levels. It is very important to really have a clear organization from the national to regional to global, and have clear networks. For example, what Gustavo have mentioned, we already have defined, at least for the Mesoamerica and in Mexico in particular. And it would be very, very crucial to really have a very clear organization on how they will be selecting their representatives into this platform. I would also say that I would also say that we have some clear experiences of how we have been collaborating and working with local communities. As you may have heard, we have been negotiating as well, aside from negotiating for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we have also been negotiating as Indigenous Peoples Caucus on the Climate Change to have direct access for Indigenous peoples in some of the climate fund mechanisms. And a clear example of this is the dedicated, what we call the dedicated grant mechanism for Indigenous peoples and local communities. This was initially negotiated by Indigenous peoples with the World Bank, and when we got it, it was expanded to include support for local communities. And we have agreed into that expansion to local communities. And very clearly, we know that there are countries who do not recognize Indigenous peoples or who do not have clear national frameworks of who are the Indigenous peoples in their countries. But they clearly recognize their local communities who have also been sustaining the forest or managing their own ecosystems. And in this example of a dedicated grant mechanism that I'm talking about under the Forest Investment Program, we have clear examples in Mozambique who have been implementing sustainable forest management systems, as also shared by Gustavo in their case in Mexico. We have also in Ghana, the local communities are the ones who are managing and implementing their climate smart cocoa production, as well as in Brazil, we have the Helombolas, who are the traditional local communities, small farming communities who are also doing their own specific programs for their own capacity building processes. So we have experiences on how we support local communities in their own, as they define themselves as local communities, and as they also determine what kind of programs that they want to implement. At the same time, I would also, in addition to the collaboration that and partnerships that we have with local communities, I would also like to mention that we cannot discount on the fact that there are also some conflicts between indigenous peoples and local communities in some countries. There are some government programs in some countries wherein local communities of farmers are settled in indigenous people's territories, and this results to some conflicts in relation to the management of resources, the degradation of the lands or the forests, and this has to be considered as well by the governments in relation to how we should be more cautious in working or in collaborating with indigenous peoples and local communities. So I think I will, those are just some of the experiences that we had so far. And again, I would reiterate that to enhance the participation of local communities, they should really have, they should also work with their governments on how they should be legally recognized, or for having a legal framework like as mentioned already by Gustavo, and at the same time to have their own organizational mechanisms to come up with their own representatives to the LCIPP on whatever way that they decide on their own processes as well as on their representation. So I think I will just end up to that and give the floor to the others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grace, and thank you for sharing your thoughts about involving local communities in this in our process. Now I would like to hand over the floor to Nigel Rahul, is our next speaker, and he's the Chief of Section Small Islands and Indigenous Knowledge at UNESCO. Nigel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much to both the Facilitative Working Group and the UNFCCC Secretariat for the invitation. It might, if there's a... Thank you. Our work at UNESCO is to look at the mobilization of local and indigenous knowledge systems, obviously in favor of the SDGs, but particularly we're looking at climate change and biodiversity issues. Our section is also the host of the technical support unit to IFBES on indigenous and local knowledge, and we help facilitate dialogues between scientists, indigenous peoples, and local communities. I listened over the weekend to the discussions within the Facilitative Working Group, and I've tried to address a bit the ideas to that. But as I was putting together the presentation, I thought I would put this photo first, which tells a bit of a story by itself. This is a family friend. This is Jorma Leinonen, and it's about -23 in this photograph, and he's doing traditional fishing that he learned from his parents. This is Kainu, which is a subarctic region of Finland, and he's managed to use a piece of wood to follow the underwater current in the winter under the ice to get his net to come out on the other side, and he catches fish all winter long. He's also, of all the people I've met, is the best mushroom hunter that I've ever dealt with, and he has an amazing knowledge of wild berry collection in the Kainu forests. And it's just an example. This is a sort of completely average human being in Kainu, but he has this whole body of ecological knowledge that was passed down orally. It's in his own language, and he actually won't tell you where to find the best laka, Arctic cloudberries, unless you're really part of the family, because that's the kind of knowledge that you don't tell everybody around you. But the other point of the picture is that Finland is one of the few countries where they took the local system of knowledge about lake biodiversity and turned it into a legalized mechanism. So the Kalastuskunta system allows fishing permits to be issued by local communities, and the national government supports that. There's a science behind it. But the point of it is that in the European regional assessment for IPBES, Finland in particular, but also some of the other Nordic states, have an increasing level of biodiversity in their lake and river system, whereas most of Western Europe has a declining biodiversity. So while we're talking about knowledge, governance systems, how decisions get made is as important as the actual knowledge itself. So there's an institutional component to it. So just touching on the work of the LCIPP is obviously growing out of the Paris Agreement and looking at the mobilization of, as they've defined, traditional knowledge of indigenous people and local knowledge systems. And the LCIPP has defined clearly its function, which is around the strengthening of knowledge, technologies, practices, and the efforts of local communities and indigenous peoples. So in the UN system, there isn't a definition, and John has covered some of that about what is meant by local communities, but there are practices within the UN system. We're also talking about the fact that this is the International Year of Indigenous Languages. In the human population at the moment, there's about 6,500 languages. Most of those belong to indigenous people, but also most of those are closely associated with specific ecological niches. So in that Kainu dialect of Finnish, it's related to the Kainu forests. And we have to think about that correlation of biological and cultural diversity as an integral part of what our sustainability needs to look like as we're moving forward. Most of human knowledge around biodiversity is held in oral systems in languages that are non-dominant. So the challenge in UNESCO that we're exploring is how do mostly oral systems of knowledge that are non-dominant but are very powerful in their content and observation, how are they possibly transmitted into data, evidence, analysis, and actions that help strengthen science policy dialogue? I won't go through this in too much detail, but the concept of indigenous peoples is clearly defined in the UN system. There's an overriding mechanism, a tool adopted by the General Assembly in 2007 that sets out the rights of indigenous peoples, which is part of international law. The key element which we keep coming back to is that indigenous peoples self-identify. As we move forward to looking at local communities, for many regions of the world, there is a distinction between indigenous peoples and local communities, but often there's an overlap in knowledge, not an overlap necessarily in identity. Indigenous peoples have specific rights in specific territories. But in the African and Asian context, indigeneity is closely associated with certain types of livelihoods and historical usage of lands and resources. So typically we look at examples of hunting and gathering, transhuman pastoralism, rotational farming, dryland farming, artisanal fishing, including long-distance ocean navigation. And it's these specific communities that bring very valuable knowledge into the discussions on climate adaptation and mitigation. And it's often those communities that are also not included in the normal national dialogue. So to draw attention to that specialized knowledge. But also we see specialized ecosystems, and this may also be relevant to the FWG, is indigenous peoples and some local communities have specialized experiences in the cryosphere, in mountain landscapes, arid and semi-arid regions, oases, often overlooked, lake and river systems, tropical, dryland, and boreal forests. coastlines, islands, atolls, which are different in characteristics from other islands, and high seas usage. So there is a correlation between knowledge systems, language systems, and livelihoods in relation to the specific ecosystem in which they have flourished over time. So local communities, I think part of the challenge is to look at local communities as knowledge holders, and then what is their relationship with national policy making on climate change, their ability to interact with decision making, but also the fact that they are sitting also with rich knowledge systems around ecosystems, how land is used, and we've heard some examples in the room up to now. One of the things in UNESCO that we've been dealing with is the rise in the use of citizen science and participatory research. So communities that definitely do not identify as indigenous peoples are mobilizing and using new technologies to express their knowledge, to explore their knowledge, and to represent that in data. So this is just an example from a book on marine citizen science, and looking at how you bring in community-based knowledge. And the only point I want to emphasize here is the goal is not just to release data and statistics. The goal is this is social participation. There's a knowing of how the economy works. There's a knowing of the land. There's a value system coming in as well. So this is the added value of having local communities actively involved in decision making. It's about its relevance to the local context. And also to say adaptation can only ever happen locally. You cannot have adaptation remotely. The last thing to say, and you can find the materials online, is that we have almost 20 years now of working with small island developing states on helping schools and communities use different types of participatory research, including Sandwatch. And in some islands now in the Caribbean and the Pacific, they have now almost 20 years of data generated by schools and local communities, which is really helping policymakers understand the changing coastlines of their countries. We also did very recently a project in cooperation with the University of the South Pacific, where local communities and indigenous peoples engaged in their own analysis and research of loss and damage. So this is the first time we've done this, and it shows that you can apply local knowledge in different contexts, in adaptation, loss and damage, and in mitigation. The one thing I want to say is a bit complex, I'll translate in a short sentence. But participatory research, these tools that allow communities to talk about their environments and what they know and how they use it, this can really help with what they call multidimensional statistics. So a lot of the small island developing states, they have middle-level economies, so they don't easily receive development aid. Yet a single storm can run over the top of them and their entire economy will be wiped out within hours. So their concern is around the relationship between vulnerability and economic capacity. And the knowledge systems of the local people can help you have a picture of their resilience and their vulnerability in relation to the landscapes and how the land, what is the situation. So just because you're on an island doesn't necessarily mean you're vulnerable, but it could. So there's ways of putting participatory research tools and local knowledge to work to help you have predictive capacity in vulnerability and resilience. And also there's an entire new body of technologies emerging. Indigenous peoples are using technologies, local communities are using technologies, so it's worth exploring that. And I just wanted to touch on the issue of Savannah fire knowledge work. There's some very good work happening between Indigenous peoples and local communities on that. And also the use of the cyber tracker technologies, eye tracker technologies, new databases. So I'll stop there because we're really short of time. But just to say thank you, and we hope that we can continue working with you on these different types of knowledge mobilization.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And last but not least, I would like to invite Jon Fernandez, Lorena Indigenous Peoples Team Leader at the Food and Agriculture Organizations of the United Nations to take the floor and to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair, It's great to be here and so much learning and so much to reflect on. Let me try to, being the last one, besides everybody is looking forward to get out of the room, another one of the issues is the fact that many points have already been covered by many of the colleagues. So let me go to some of the points I would like to cover in my presentation. I will talk a little bit about some of the difference and complementarities between indigenous peoples and local communities, and some examples that I think are relevant, particularly in relation to indigenous food systems, where we are working very strongly in an agricultural organization. But also let me share with you some experiences from the FAO side that we have run into in terms of the participation at the international level with indigenous peoples and local communities that we have faced also in our organization. And some of the lessons learned and how we manage them. We've been working for over 70 years with local communities in the forms of farmers, fishers, forest dwellers, and family farmers in terms of economic and livelihood activities that the people relate to and how they access different fora and how they've been working with our organization. But only since 2010, FAO has started to work with indigenous peoples and pastoralists in a more coordinated and coherent way. We created an FAO Indigenous Peoples team in 2014 and a pastoralist knowledge hub in 2014 as well. And in 2019, we have started to work in a better and a more harmonious way on Afro-descendants and the issues that relate to them. So it is different, indigenous peoples from local communities in many ways, in terms of spirituality, traditional knowledge, governance, and customary practices, even though at the same time, there's complementarities and there is overlapping in some cases. One difference that we have often found is the issue of collectivity and collective rights to communal areas versus a more individual access to individually managed land or natural resources. They both play an essential role in terms of how we can confront the climate crisis that has been alluded. But then the situation is dynamic. We have different concepts, different definitions, but what is true is that in the end, the people they are living there in the territories. Actually, we see governments change, but the people remain. And very often with governments and with parties, the definitions and the concepts that the UN we use and the governments and the experts we use, they come and go, but the people remain. There is a series of right issues behind the differentiation of indigenous peoples and local communities that has been already covered by some of the colleagues. A major issue in terms of indigenous peoples is the invisibility that sometimes they suffer in many societies and how this jeopardizes their access to other very basic human rights. And this is not necessarily the case for local communities. It's more, we have noticed it's more affected by indigenous people. Let me give two examples. In El Salvador, it was a country where officially there were no indigenous peoples until very recently. And today, after reforming the constitution, is one of the first countries that has a national plan on indigenous peoples, the Plan PS, that has been done in a participatory manner. So we moved from non-indigenous peoples to having a national indigenous peoples plan. But let me share some important highlights in relation to Mexico that put on the front line the self-identification that our other colleagues have mentioned. There's 68 indigenous peoples and Afro-Mexicans. But when we see the people that are speaking indigenous languages, it's only 7.4 million. But if we ask how many people are living in indigenous households, it's 12 million people. But if we ask how many people self-define themselves as indigenous peoples, the number goes to 25.7. So that's 21% of the population in Mexico. So again, the concept of definition is important, but not so much, because depending on how we approach it, it has different connotations. Let me give two examples on when we work with indigenous food systems, issues that we came about from local communities and indigenous peoples. We established a methodology with biodiversity to profile indigenous food systems and their relation to sustainability and climate resilience. We put together a methodology, and one of the things that was highlighted, particularly in India, in the Himalayas, with mountain communities, the Dudoli and the Nayal, was the issues they have with climate resilience and the issues they have of changing their traditional patterns of food systems. And I will cover another case from Cameroon about the Baka people, indigenous community in Cameroon. What happened with the Dudoli and the Nayal in Himalaya in India was that the unreliable changes in the rainfall pattern, they changed the winter snow cover, and that changed the hydrological cycle so vastly that their traditional farming practices completely collapsed. And the reliability on the traditional yields, the traditional crops and the traditional medicinal plants completely changed. So they have to move from a traditional organically food crops, moving into more market foods oriented. And they did that with the change of the climatic pattern. So they start, for example, including fruits like pomegranate and guava that were completely exogenous to their food system, and even soybeans. So it has completely changed the lives of these local communities that might not consider themselves indigenous, but certainly climate change has affected them drastically. The BACA, the analysis we did of these communities in Cameroon, they are indigenous, they are hunting and gathering, they practice shifting cultivation in the forest, and they had a system called, during the Molongo, or the long-term foraging, that consists on consuming wild yams. And this is done over an extensive surface of forest. Because of national parks, and this is an issue that we covered this year, the challenge between conservation and indigenous peoples. Because of the national parks, they stop their movements. The authorities stop the capacity that they have to go after these local yams. As a result, part of their food system has collapsed, and they have also had to rely on different exchanges with the Bantu communities that are not indigenous, with different connotations for the society. So in the territory, we do have indigenous peoples and local communities facing different issues and approaching the situations they have in a completely different matter very often. What have we done? At the international level in FAO, one of the things that we have done is differentiate between the representativeness by constituency and when we organize subject experts seminars to allow to have the insights from different people and different realities without jeopardizing the issues of representativeness that is extremely complex and very political, as we know. We have a number of technical committees, the Committee on Forestry, the Committee of Agriculture, the Committee of Fisheries, the Commission on Genetical Resources, and they have been involving local communities for a number of years. Very known to many of you is probably the World Committee on Food Security that was reformed in 2009 through a constituency system to allow the participation in policy making of the different stakeholders, and one of them is indigenous people. And the result of the CFS has been that many of the guidelines that they have released and been endorsed are actually much more representative of the voices of local communities and indigenous peoples, from the right to food guidelines to the voluntary guidelines of tenure, and lastly, the responsible agricultural investment. Now, there is issues that have been mentioned, language, access to information, the capacity to follow some of the technical discussions, the capacity to travel from the local communities, the need for resources to ensure the participation of communities and local participation. And what is important is to avoid that the participation of local communities somehow jeopardizes or undermines the participation of indigenous peoples. That will be something that is not desirable. It's difficult to find a balance between the self-organization, the representation, and the technical capacity to contribute to the discussions. This is something that we have faced very often, probably in FAO because of the technical nature of our work, and sometimes it's difficult to solve this problem through the self-representation and self-organization. And you need to identify experts within local communities and indigenous peoples that can really bring points together with universities and some of the scientists. It's also complicated for some organizations to move from advocacy towards policy recommendation. And one of the things that we have seen is the risk of crystallizing the participation of certain organizations that in the end tend to dominate the discussion and don't allow the participation of more local or indigenous communities. There is difference in the approaches between indigenous peoples we have seen and local communities in terms of spirituality, in terms of the governance systems they have, in terms of the right approach and how they face the different situations. How are we working with indigenous peoples and local communities? A renowned initiative is the Global Indigenous Agricultural Heritage Systems, that identifies both indigenous people's ways of generating food across the world, but also local communities. And it's been going on for a number of years, and it's an example of complementarity. But as you know, we are in the decade of family farming, and we've recently launched the decade in Rome, and a number of local communities came that represent themselves through social movements from the farmer organizations, from fisher and forest. There were very few indigenous peoples. So we tend to see the contrary. We tend to see a dominance of many local organizations that are working in a number of livelihood activities, but we had a difficulty seeing indigenous people's participation, not only the CFS, but in many of the technical committees of the organization. That is a lesson learned that we want to share with the work you're doing. In November 2018, we had the high-level expert seminar on indigenous food systems, and we invited many of the mountain local communities to present their work because they share many of the challenges that indigenous peoples did. And we are preparing for September this year an expert seminar on indigenous peoples' Arctic traditional fisheries to invite indigenous peoples from the Arctic to really present the challenges that they are facing vis-a-vis climate change. And we would like to extend the invitation to you because it relates very much to the work that you're doing. I'm talking too much, so let me start concluding and to say that we believe it's very important to maintain a balance that ensures that the different views of indigenous peoples and local communities are listened to and taken into account and reflected into the policy discussion of the parties and decision makers at local, regional, and global level. But it's important to involve the local communities, but not at the expense of indigenous people's participation, who historically have been often left out of key policy discussions affecting their lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jan. And thank you all speakers for your very interesting presentations. And it sounds to me that the local communities have a vast amount of knowledge they could bring to the LCIPP's work. So just to remind you that Secretariat will be putting together a report of this workshop, and you will be able to read it, and it will be made available on the website. And all the presentations you have seen here today will be also be made available on our website. So, it's 10 to 7, and we should finish this workshop at 7. So if you could stay for 5 more minutes so that we could take a couple of questions before we close this workshop. I see Graham has a question, please.
Question/comment. Anin, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to appreciate all our esteemed colleagues and the expertise and experiences that they've shared, and I think also just demonstrated one of the benefits of having a space for knowledge dissemination and translation. And I think this is a good example of how experiences can be shared in a way that hopefully will be reflected constructively by the Secretariat. I will note, though, I think there's in recognition of the title of this workshop, there's also a direct reflection on how do we enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples within the LCIP. And I know that building off of the 2 comments in the last panel, we've been discussing this for a long time. So I'd like to just provide some opening remarks and not try to take up too much space. I think the first and one of the most relevant recognitions of this notion of participation is interlinked to what a lot of representatives identified as this rights-based framework. And the rights-based framework identifies the sovereignty and nationhood associated with Indigenous peoples. And when we're talking about exchanging of knowledge, I think it's misguided to talk about it without connecting it to those broader discussions about nationhood and participation in governance. The way that I think Elder Paulette and other elders that I've worked with have shared the connection between Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous ways of life are non-existent. And only when we think about putting Indigenous peoples in positions of decision-making can we really meaningfully talk about the inclusion of their knowledge systems. And so I would hope as we embark on this journey and want to acknowledge the massive step forward that the Facilitative Working Group took as it enabled Indigenous peoples and states to come together to make decisions. And I can't help but think there's some interesting linkages to the work that the Facilitative Group is doing right now in the development of their work plan. And it's clear that this facilitating function has already started. I'll also just want to note that some of the things that I think we've talked about for a long time are about this consideration of how do you mainstream Indigenous people's voices across the UNFCCC and across other UN-related bodies. And our esteemed colleague at the end of his presentation noted the importance of Indigenous peoples and their inclusion in climate policy. And I think one of the things that we've all shared is that this Facilitative Working Group, as well as the platform, is one step into how do we mainstream and include Indigenous people's voices in climate policy, particularly when we're talking about addressing the climate emergency and climate crisis. And I think it would be remiss of myself to not acknowledge some of the existing participation barriers that Indigenous peoples face right now. Procedurally, I think we've talked about how do Indigenous peoples participate as governments, not other constituencies, for example. In terms of badges, in terms of funding, we had the opportunity to talk with the Facilitative Working Group about a space dedicated to Indigenous peoples, including at COP25, both in terms of sharing the expertise that many representatives have already shared today. I'll note our colleague from Cameroon articulated very eloquently the importance of Indigenous voices and why states should be listening. And also, we also discussed the importance of having space for ceremony. And I would hope that as we embark on this journey for COP25, we take a lot of those considerations to heart and try to mainstream them in our collective approach. I think that might hopefully provide a little bit of context to that second component in this title. So miigwech, and looking forward to the comments.
Thank you, Graham. There was also a question from Cameroon, and I can see also Chile.
Okay.
And then I would allow the speakers to respond, and then we need to close the meeting.
Thank you once again for giving me the chance to speak. My name is Tabi Joda, and I want to start by explaining a little bit the meaning of my name to you people. It's an indigenous name that means the interpreter of the weather system. And most often we have been talking about climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and building resilience for climate risk, and the inclusion of indigenous people. My question is, are we just including indigenous people for participation's sake or for solution's sake? Where are you looking at the reason or the need for indigenous people's participation? This links me to what the gentleman just said a little bit. The value of the knowledge must be the reason why people participate as indigenous people, not just for the sake of being indigenous. Otherwise, we will keep on making that same mistake of jumping over why this science is needed, but the right people who have this science are somewhere, and those who just happen to be part of that community are speaking about something they don't hold the value, they don't hold the knowledge of it. So I want to tell you also today that in my you are aware that you have indigenous knowledge that can hold the rain from falling around this environment? It exists in my community. If we want to have a traditional ceremony here and the rain wants to come, we can stop the rain from this environment. And that's the science, that's indigenous science. It's adaptation. Where does the rain go to? And we have the indigenous knowledge that interprets the weather. In 2017, I had the Africa Prize for Climate Information Service Indigenous Innovation. But this is not known anywhere, because most often the indigenous people who come to speak to you are those people who just know how to speak. They're not the people who have the valuable knowledge that you need for adaptation, the knowledge that we need for data collection, for future resilience building for communities. Otherwise, we keep this knowledge stockpiled somewhere and it never gets to the right full decision-making system that needs to be corroborated into data collection for more information and for more decision-making, meeting up with the Paris Agreement, in meeting up the SDGs, in meeting up the Sendai framework. So my request is this, please, stop, or I'm not instructing. Can we limit our access or too much access to those who just speak or who just participate as indigenous people for the sake of participating as indigenous people, and get access to the community leadership or the community people who hold that science? So I'm calling on you, 3 recommendations. The science of studying the weather still exists in my community, and we are very free to share it with the world. This is very important because climate information service is very valuable to adaptation, is valuable to resilience, is valuable to predicting farming situations. Food security is impossible without understanding weather conditions, when to farm and when not to farm. Weather climate information system is very important in predicting even situations for the lowland or small island countries that are susceptible to increasing floods. Second recommendation, speak to the indigenous men and women who hold the knowledge. Third recommendation, speak to the young boys and girls, indigenous boys and girls, who still have timidly some signs you can see them expressing on themselves. Sometimes they don't even know that this is the science, but they have it. Let's not only see African photos displayed just in situations of, when you have to depict the crisis situation, but when it comes to the solution situation, we don't see them coming on board. So I'm sorry for taking so much time, but I pray we all collaborate, we all work in the same spirit, and we all really open our hearts to each other and listen to nature so we can achieve the goals. Thank you.
Thank you for these thoughts. So unfortunately, I have another commitment and I have to leave. I'm really sorry for that. But my co-moderator, Andrea, can stay with you for 10 more minutes. I think it's been a really fruitful and interesting exchange, and we have started to build a bridge that hopefully will bring the local communities to do this platform's work. And with that, I thank you very much for your participation, and I hand the floor over to the lady in black. Please also say who you are and try to please be very brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe my colleague to my right has actually been waiting longer than me to speak, so I would gratefully yield the microphone to him, and if there is time, I would like to say something.
Thank you, and I'd like to remind you to keep your comments brief. We want to come back to the panelists and let them say a couple of minutes of closing statements. So it's already after 7 o'clock, and I appreciate, we started late, so I feel okay. We should let this go a little bit more. I don't think anyone's pressing to use the room, but again, please keep your comments brief. I have 3 or 4 people on the list here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. I am Dilraj Khanal. I am from Nepal. Nepal is one of the pioneer country for the management of community forestry through more than 22,000 community forest user groups who are managing more than 40% forest land as a community forest with the joint effort of indigenous people and local communities. And actually, as a representative of local communities, my experience is that the networking, particularly at local, national, and global level, is really very important to enhance the participation of local communities, not only in the LCIPP platform, but all other different type of decision-making process. Therefore, as a representative of local communities, what I want to highlight that without supporting to recognize the legal right of local communities and without supporting the networking at different level, actually the local community and their representative organization will not be able to participate in those type of global mechanism. Therefore, how we can enhance the networking association, federation of local communities who are managing forest, land, water, and other different natural resources to address climate mitigation and adaptation. Therefore, again and again, what I want to highlight that if we are interested to enhance the full and effective participation of local communities in different decision-making process and different platform, the networking is one of the best options. Therefore, we have to support to the local communities to develop their network at local, national, and global level. For example, in Nepal, we have established our national level Federation of Community Forestry Users Nepal, which is called FECOFON. And we are also supporting and facilitating to establish different network, particularly in Asia and Pacific countries, to establish the community forestry network at national level, which are being able to advocate their right by themselves, particularly during the policy and law-making process. Therefore, again, at the end of, I would like to highlight that in the network there is a power of community. Without network, without association, without federation, they cannot express their concern, voice, and experience and lessons. Therefore, I think that we all know the importance of association and networking of local communities. Therefore, we have to give emphasis in that effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have the government of Chile on the list as a host of the next COP. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair. On behalf of Chile, I would like to thank to SBSTA, the Secretariat, the Facilitative Working Group, and all the participants in this important in-session thematic workshop, which allows sharing knowledge and experiences to strengthen the participation of indigenous people and local communities in the LCIPP of the UNFCCC. I just wanted to indicate that regarding this matter, in Chile we have 4 trees and challenges. In 1993, a national law created the Indigenous Development Corporation, at which we recognize nine groups of indigenous people. And in 2008, we ratified the 1C9 Convention of ILO, which is part of our legislation since 2009. In the multilateral context, we have participated in various initiatives. In this year, which marks the International Year of Indigenous Languages at the UN level, we hope to have a wide program to commemorate this important date. In addition, we recently approved a law that recognizes people of African descent, which would allow us to get closer to the recognition of local communities in our country. This is something new in Chile, taking into account which has been addressed in this interesting presentation. However, as I mentioned, we are not exempt from challenges, and there is a lot of work to do in the context of facing climate change. For that reason, I want to express the Chileans' interest in this initiative, and as the incoming presidency of COP25, we want to contribute to the success of the LCIPP process. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. At this point, we're going to need to wrap this up. I know people are going to start to need to leave. But I want to give, like we did in the last panel, an opportunity for the panelists to say some brief closing remarks. So with that, I'll begin with Grace. If you'd like to make final comments. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I just would like to reiterate the self-selection process for local communities to be represented in this LCIPP platform. And again, we will be very supportive on how this one will develop along the process. And of course, yeah, thank you again very much for your contributions and participation, and we continue with this dialogue as we progress in making the operationalize this LCIPP platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. Yon, would you like to make some closing comments?
I think also to congratulate the initiative, and which is extremely important. I think with this, in FAO, we've been for years allowing the participation of different constituencies, and we have run into some difficulties, and we have learned from them and move on, because in the end, what is essential is that and I think a colleague said that the right people are at the right discussion so that contributions can be made. So congratulations for the initiative, and there's a lot of dialogue that needs to be done.
Thank you. Thank you also for your closing comments. Just to wrap it up, and we're going to have a brief closing prayer so we can all go forward in a good way with clear minds and find our path for the next steps. Just some core issues that have been raised from our point of view is just in response to the gentleman from Cameroon, to recall that we have not even had a beginning global meeting of the platform itself. This is an activity that was mandated by COP24 for the LCIPP, but we have in our work plan opportunities for knowledge holders from all regions to come together on core issues of concern that are cross-cutting, whether it be water, whether it be food sovereignty and subsistence, whether it be the role of women, Indigenous women, and transmission of knowledge, intergenerational knowledge transmission. We are still in the process of looking for that, but the platform is a place. It's not an organization, and it will be open to all knowledge holders. And I really look forward, as a member of the Facilitative Working Group, to the time when we are able to bring those knowledge holders together to begin to talk about the things that you have addressed. My peoples, traditional peoples, also in the desert, where desert people engage in weather prediction, and so we know what kind of seeds to plant for what kind of year it would be coming. So very important discussions that we hope to have and engage everybody from across all the regions. Clearly, some points that were raised here was an interest in looking at the participation of local communities. That's the name of the platform. So we are looking forward to seeing how that will develop, and just keeping in mind, as I said to the beginning, and others have referred to, that the Indigenous peoples constituency is very well organized, not just here, but in many, many different bodies over 40 years of engagement. And we have a very clear representation policy in terms of how delegates are selected to participate in various bodies, including the Facilitative Working Group, is a regional process. So we also take on board what several have said, that we recognize that may take some time for local communities, whether there's a criteria for them, whether they self-identify or some combination. We recognize and respect that that will take some time to talk about a representational process for engagement. At the same time, with meetings of the platform, they'll be open to everyone to come and begin to engage, share traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge, as they're saying. So with those comments, and just to conclude, a couple of points that both Grace and Jan mentioned, we want to make sure that we proceed with this process in a good way, and not in a way that in any way impedes on the hard-fought recognition and participation for the rights and engagement of Indigenous peoples, and understand that we're going to need to keep that balance as we move forward, and hope that all of you will assist in making sure that advancement, by one constituency doesn't negatively impact another constituency, and that we see this as a positive way of moving forward together in that way. So with that view towards positive outcome as we move forward on this path, however long it may take, I'd like to ask the Secretariat, do they have any final comments? And then turn the floor over to Chief Francois Paulette for a closing prayer, so we can all leave this room in a good way and united in our purpose.
Thank you, Andre. Just one quick comment that on Friday at 1 o'clock in the room VN12, we have a partnership building dialogue under the LCIPP. So anyone that would like to come to that, it is an open meeting, and it will look at how partnerships can be built under the platform outside of the convention particularly, so other processes such as some of the ones we've heard today, but everybody's welcome to come and share at that meeting. Thank you.
Salatina, Masi Norsi. I'm thankful to be here. I am honored to listen to Indigenous peoples and where they come from, their homeland. Tomorrow I will be returning home, and I live in the bush. I don't live in a town. I live by a big river, and when I leave my home, my family, the singers that I have that sing in ceremony, very much are concerned about where I go. So we have ceremony, and so when I return home, we conduct ceremony again. But I will be thinking about this moment. I'll be thinking about this path that, as Indigenous people, in our knowledge, in our spiritual knowledge, our sacred knowledge, that expands back to, in memory, our knowledge is infinite. And as long as we know that, we teach that to our children. And whatever happens in the future, in the next while, that that we always return to that knowledge. We always go back to the land. Return, go back to the sacred lands that you have. And prayer is a big part of our indigenous knowledge, and just return back to that. That's what's going to take us into the future in a good way. And I hope that Chile, and when we're in that country, that there'll be a place where indigenous people can conduct ceremonies. So we always praying each day, and that people come from other parts of the world, they can conduct their ceremonies. I ask for that, because sometimes I come to this place, there's no place to conduct ceremony. So I just want to ask for, because people from where I come from ask about that. So I'm just going to close with a prayer. You just remain seated and you pray in the best way that you know how, the way you've been taught. Honoris causa ken is on whenever the law of the Asibiko Jantilla. Hada Batara, no need to type Nasi, no to Jania Hunter Sibata, or Yaku Hukun, nor Skid. Three house Conasi or Connie Till City, a Savalite see, a Hunter see, the whenever the law of the Asil, a Savalite, the Hunter Skid. Nor skin as a sea, done you see, a banana street. When Sananake così still a sea, here the Naki killed our Kenezo, Yaki Sucha Nate Hando, Tino Skid. And there, Batari, a Kenezo must see no receipt. In my language, there's a word that we say, Hoshkon. Hoshkon means visitors, and we're working together. And Hoshkon, when we come together, we have a voice and we share knowledge. And that's how humans grow. Adele Mercy, thank you. You have a good evening, and you have a wonderful next few days. I have a partner of mine, his name is Bill Erasmus. He'll be arriving, he'll be taking over. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good dinner and a good evening.